also with you.
Let us pray. Gracious and ever-living, ever-loving God, be with us now as we contemplate the worship we offer you and great gifts. This is the last of three, and I hope it will be the most informal. In some ways, it's going to have to be the most informal because various things will happen. We'll just have to stop what we're doing at that point and shift. So when the pastor comes in with his various garments, we'll just stop and talk about clerical vestments. We will be doing music. Doc is going to do a little bit about music. If the choir comes in, then we have to maneuver, and when the altar guild comes in, we'll stop and talk about some of the aspects of the altar task. And have you been in an altar guild? Okay, good. I would need help. Let's start with the space in which we're right now. The Christian church, well, in fact, let me just say one of the things that there's a couple takeaways from today's session. Probably the most important takeaway that's historic is that almost all the aspects of worship that we associate with the church started as secular in the late antique world. The late antique world would be from about 350 to 500. So that everything started as ordinary space. Why? Because there were all of these temples that existed that were worshiping various gods, and the Christian church wanted to have nothing to do with those pagan gods, which they thought were devils. And so they appropriated secular space, secular garb, secular practice in various cases. So while we think now, for example, of clerical garb, that's just what you would have seen among the upper classes in the late antique Roman Empire. The church itself was the celibate form of the church, which became the standard. Went from house church, these larger so-called piece of the church, when the emperor adopted Christianity as first listed and then the only religion. Basilica was a standard secular space, which the church took over, reoriented in some ways, and used in much the same way that the secular space used. Now, a basilica, does anyone know what a basilica looks like? Long and narrow. We do not have we're going to stop right now. You have to. All right, you see now.
I've never gotten the model before.
Yes. Now, a couple of comments about clerical dresses. As I said, they're essentially secular dress, and if you think about it, there are three parts to clerical dress. There's the indoor dress, and there's the outdoor, and there's certain signs of office. So this is a cassock, which would be often worn outdoors, and you have the buttons down.
I do. I didn't button them all. I'm fully clothed.
And then this is the surplice that would go over it. You often see choir boys in England wearing something like that.
I think that choir surplices are so cotton.
Yes, and they're often shorter as well.
Yeah.
But basically, if you think about it, the surplice or the owl, which is the white gown, was simply indoor dress. It's what people would wear normally indoors that would be formal. Often with a cincture, which you're wearing tonight.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of cinctures.
No? The cincture is essentially the tie.
Makes a heavy guy look heavier.
Yes.
I don't really see the pastor's belly hanging over the door. I don't want to be that.
What you can do is that you actually nowadays you can put a loop on here, which holds it up here, and it hides the fact that you're really going out a long way. So this would be the cassock would be an outdoor, and this is an indoor, but it's on over the top. Now you have the owl and the chasuble. You'll be back to that.
I will be.
And the stole.
And if you grew up in the Lutheran church, you may very well make some of this growing up, because this is what I first remember back in the 70s, before LBW. And the pastor would go over the E grade, which I thought was awesome, because he'd go over it and all of a sudden the whole outfit would go and then would go back down as the pastor.
But not as interesting as Marilyn Monroe.
No.
One last thing. This right here, the collar. It's not traditional. In fact, the so-called
This is the dog collar or the
tap. The tap collar. And they all wear around they are modern or late early modern inventions. And they go on with clips.
And then the tabs just slide in plastic.
Yeah.
The dog collars, the ones that go all the way around, are very long.
Yes, and they would you would have to.
Like little buttons that have maneuver with them. So.
And is it true that those collars give you discounts at sporting events?
It used to be that the collar would give you some benefits like that, but not anymore. Not that I thought. Not that I'm looking, but it used to be able to discount at some hospital cafeterias, and that's not the case anymore.
And you just want to tell how hot
Oh, yeah, okay. Well, that I did not know. But the stole you'll see later, which is, in this season is the green band. In the late antique world, the stole was a sign of rank. And it's just sort of like a military rank, that you could wear epaulets or stripes on your. Similarly, in the ancient world, you had stripes on your allet that indicated rank. And then the most important rank was the stole, which was used by very high governors. And then the stole, you kind of will see it when it comes in. The bishops had their own particular, I think it's called palladium, which was a V-neck. And deacons would wear the stole across. So basically what you're talking about is your rank insignia that was originally secular rank, the aristocracy, and it's taken over by the church. One of the things that the ancient world and the medieval and early modern world did was to try to control very much what people wore. So you could look at somebody and tell what their rank was. So in Luther's time, they spent a lot of effort in saying how many feathers and what type of fur women could wear, and how much of it. Because they didn't want, because they had a social hierarchy, and they didn't want people, to pretend they were something that they weren't. They were trying to control everything as static as possible. Yes?
You may have noticed that Franklin wears a deacon stole, which was a gift to him from a former pastor.
Yeah.
Goes across the back.
Yeah, it goes from I think it's from right to left. And we'll get back to the space. Normally the space was long and narrow, and what you would have is at one end you would have an elevated chair, which was based on what governors would do. A governor would be seated on sort of like a throne at the end, and the audience would come in and present things. That's the same thing that happens with the bishop. The bishop sits in his chair on an elevated platform. And you know what the word for chair is? Cathedral. The cathedral. So the cathedral is where the bishop's chair. You know what the other word for chair? Seat. So when the Pope announces something ex cathedra, have you ever heard that expression? Which is supposed to be authoritative. It's what they're doing is they're saying from the chair. Now again, the chair was used for governors and rulers and for people who were academic or rhetoricians who were teachers. So again, it's a secular use that's being moved over into the church. I'll just stop right there. Now let's look around here. remember, it's based on the synagogue. The synagogue, where was an altar in Jewish? There's only one altar. In the temple. The synagogue is a place of worship, but it doesn't have so that altars, actually, the notion that this is an altar is a later development. It starts out as a table. As a table, we would go all the way around it. But for a long time, the church was, because they thought it was an altar, they pushed it up against the wall, and then the pastor would stand like this with the congregation behind him, standing, pews, and they would sit down as a recent development. But the original, and that's one of the part of the liturgical revival, is to make this more like a table, and to bring it so that the congregation can surround it like a table. We have now our model pastor. So, the surplus is normally a linen, narrow sleeve garment, which was the traditional indoor dress of the upper classes, both men and women. And then the stole is the mark of rank. And only the pastor could wear the stole this way. In Lutheranism and in most traditions that use the stole. Now, as we mentioned, they have the deacon, which would be crossing it that way, so with a tie, yes. You've seen Frank occasionally wear that. If you have a cincture, sometimes you'll put the stole through some of the loops, and sometimes you won't. I too agree that the cincture is not so great. Yeah. That's an indoor dress, and when the next one you'll see them putting an outdoor dress over the indoor dress. This is the chasuble, which I like to call as an ecclesiastical serape. When you hear about Jesus where they cast lots for his clothing, they're talking about this garment. Because Jesus would have worn the olive, which is simply the name for a white tunic. Probably Jesus was sleeveless. And then the cloak, this is the chasuble. And the other, it's an outdoor garment. It's for extra warmth. And it adds extra warmth. Yes, it does. That's why we don't use it most of the time. And originally, it was just two pieces of cloth sewn together, and often to cover the seams, they would put bands or something on it to add color. And later, with time, it becomes decorated in various ways. But what it is essentially is an overcoat that has the secular overcoat, but also rank, mark of rank. If you see mosaics, for example, of the Byzantine emperor and bishops, you'll see them wearing something like a chasuble. Both the emperor and the bishop, but different colors, and then with the stole. The stole would normally be put underneath. Yeah, there it is. Because, once again, this is an outer garment. The other one you often see is the coat, which is more like a cloak. It would tend to be further and clasped in the front, not necessarily, yes.
So before we were in this space, before this was built, and we had our sanctuary in the gathering area, there was an altar room. And Pastor Snyder would come in wearing the circle, the undergarment.
The album.
Okay, and then he would put a surplice across as a draping on the altar rail. Just until communion, and then ceremonies.
Yeah, in many traditions, it only needs to be worn during the celebration of communion.
And you're not supposed to wear it if there is no Eucharist.
Right. But it also means that at some point during the service, the pastor has to go out or find some place to put the chasuble. These are the churches. We have a whole set for each color. Yeah, not mine.
Yeah, these rules are traditions that develop over time as people reflect on it. They often end up having more significance than they ever should. They're a late addition. Once again, this is secular dress modified for ecclesiastical, and then as our dress change, one thing most of this square would not work well in Northern Europe. It's not warm enough. And so there were writing changes, but this stays as a large grain. There are other things that go with it. There's a handkerchief that often the bishop or priest would carry, and that was, you don't have any pockets. So in the secular dress, this was for white nose or these things, but it becomes part of the dress. Yeah. Right? Go ahead.
The manifold.
The manifold, that's it. Yeah, it's called the manifold. So here again, it's indoor and outdoor. It's a particular dress, and it gets all sorts of traditions associated with our later developments. Let's talk about major themes. One of the major themes is that worship is quite flexible. We're drawing from different parts of Christian history. A lot of it in the Eucharist from the 5th century, but we're also quoting from other Christians. Yes?
Is it always green?
No, that's the color of the season, so we didn't talk about the liturgical year. There are, the colors change. This is also a later development. This was not true in the early church. We even recently changed one of the colors. It was that you have a particular color for Advent, for Christmas season, Epiphany, Lent, Easter, and then Pentecost at an ordinary time. So, and that even changed the colors. It's part of the way we worship involves ideally all aspects of our humanity. And all the ways in which we experience. So this is a way of insight of changing. I'm sure we have enough time. You can get out of the yes. The altar, as I say, the big change was to make it more of a table, but still we wouldn't want to pull up your chair around this. This is still more like an altar. But it's table-like, and you can go all the way around it. And that is part of the liturgical revival, because the center of worship should not be the pastor performing. The center of worship is the congregation as a whole. So, for example, it would be quite possible to take all these chairs and turn them so they face each other and worship service that way. In fact, it might be a healthy thing to try some point. Point out that we're really in this all together. We're not watching a performance in the front. Rather, we're together doing, paying attention to God and faith in God and receiving His blessings as a community. Our spaces.
And that's why we started with more of a shape of a circle in some churches versus the straight line.
Exactly. It was to especially because you were changing from one set of expectations to another. To change the shape of the worship space meant that people were, without having to say it, you could realize that we're all more sort of gathered around the table. The choir is here, and it's here largely for technical reasons. The piano is big and the organ is big. But there's no reason that it has to be here. And in fact, in the ancient church, if you had a congregation and a choir, the most common place for the choir was in the center and the rear, surrounded on three sides by the congregation. And again, the advantage of that sort of arrangement is the choir singing with and helping the congregation to sing, rather than singing for the congregation, which is often the message we get. Not here, this is pretty good, but there's some where the choir is so prominent, like a single college choir gets up there with the organ, and it's a performance. But music again is one of these things that is supposed to bring the whole congregation and engage more of the senses. We'll do music in a few minutes. Let me. I could talk a lot about all the various pieces and parts of the Eucharist, the chalice, and the like. The altar guild sets things up. There are special names for everything. Unless we run out of time and I have nothing else to say, I'm just going to drop that. Instead, I want to talk about something that I understand in this congregation was quite contentious. The font and where it goes. Historically, the baptistry, as I mentioned before, even when it was a house church, tended to be a separate room. Because the assumption was you had to go through baptism before you could go in and experience the Eucharist. And the catechumens were often asked to leave when the service of the word was over, before the service of the meal began. And so this is an argument for having the font at the entrance, which is because the font is also the entrance into the church, metaphorically as well as physically. But the advantage of putting it forward, and I'm ignoring the fact this thing probably weighs 500 pounds, and you could move back and forth easily anyway, is that as Lutherans and as Christians, or the larger Christian family, we need to be reminded of our baptism daily. Because the baptism is our entrance into the death and resurrection of Christ. And so having it forward means you could begin the service not with a confession of sins, but with thanksgiving and remembrance of baptism. And I hope at some point we actually do that. I hope if you look at your ELW, you'll see that that is a possibility that's built into the services. Remember what I said back in the first session, that the confession of sins is not part of worship. Technically speaking, it's a preparation for worship. And it's based on certain historical developments in Western Christianity, which I personally see as problematic in some ways. The emphasis on sinfulness and unworthiness and making the Eucharist and worship something more and more forbidding. You have to be worthy in order to. And part of the liturgical revival is recognizing is when you're feeling sinful, when you're feeling rejected, when you're feeling unworthy, that's the time to take the Eucharist. Because the Eucharist is God's gift to us. It's not something we earn by being good. It's rather God's declaration and manifestation of the fact that He loves us even when we're unlovable. That He gave His body for us, even though we had rejected Him. And so this is another big change that the liturgical revival is responsible for recapturing some aspects of the early church, which, for reasons, complicated reasons in the West, we lost. So when it's up in front, you can remember your baptism. Also, some of us like to be able to dip our fingers and cross ourselves as we go forward. And once again, what one means by that, what is its significance for us, will vary from people. Do we have any here that do that regularly? Yes. So that's another tradition. One of the things that I would hope we, as a congregation, think about is whether we could experiment maybe in different seasons, liturgical seasons, with some different practices. Because sometimes we become so comfortable with the one way of doing something that we no longer wholly entering into the experience of worship. And that changing our routine, taking on new ways of doing, for example, talk about facing each other here, or crossing ourselves, or in Lent, actually kneeling. These are possibilities that we might consider as a congregation. I mean, this is the worship committee, which I refuse to serve on, so I'm there. This is cheap advice. We might consider trying some things, because what we do is we take worship and reignite your mind. You have to start thinking about why you're doing this one. Your soul, emotional involvement in it, your body, and of course your heart, and your will. We be part of the emotional transition of the Bible, part of the will. And that's what worship is about, should be all the whole. And this is an opportunity now, I think, with the new pastor and experimenting with things. We might also experiment in some ways with worship. You know, if we do it for a season, we do it for Lent, let's say. We're supposed to suffer anyway a little bit in Lent. And when it's over, it's over. I would like you to consider some of that. Now, one of the most important ways in which we get a heart, mind, soul, and strength together is with music. And so I'd like to ask the doctor to say a little bit about some of the music that we use.
Well, I want to talk just for a minute about what music is in this body. I can only speak from my own experience, and that is that if I sit in the congregation on a Sunday morning, I have trouble actually completely worshiping and focusing, because I don't know if it's inborn, although I suspect some of it is, or if it is the training of years and years of being in a liturgical place, in a liturgical church, and then going off to an educational space that was also centered in music. But I can't easily come into the space of worship unless I have the music. And it's not, for me, it's not just hearing what's going on. For me, it's having to be a part of what's going on. I collect hymnals. Some of you already know. I do. I collect hymnals. I have a collection of Lutheran hymnals that I, in fact, even used to illustrate my book. And I've got a couple of these hymnals here today, and those are the only two hymnals I'm going to sing, because those are the two that really formed who I am, formed my ideas about music, and those are the hymnals with which I spend all the time. I've got a dozen books here, and I'm trying to get rid of these because I am in the process of producing the next one, so if you would like to take it. Okay, so a couple more things about what music is. I loved the way that Mark introduced this. The Lutheran Church is often called the singing church. But that doesn't mean that we invented anything at all. If you go to a place that is like Africa, which is more in tune perhaps with who they were or are in connection to nature, there is much more music. If I would bring the Isamani congregation here, they would be a little bit disappointed in us. If you go to Isamani to worship, they worship with music with their entire being. They don't have instruments per se. They have some hand drums and some foot bells, but they don't need an organ. They don't need the piano. Marching in the Light of God, that song we opened with the service this morning. When I was there 3 years ago, I was sitting with a visiting pastor who was from the synod, and he said to me halfway through the service, "I've got an idea. I want to have you lead a song." So that fast I had to come up with something to do, and I thought to myself, we'll do Marching in the Light of God, because I know it in South African, and I know it in Swahili, and this will be fun. I can teach them something. They sang this song for half an hour. They sang it with every fiber of their being. We marched, we danced throughout the entire sanctuary, because this song, it's spoken. They knew it. I mean, they knew it in more languages than I knew it. They knew it in German, they knew it every of their tribal languages. They knew it before I ever got there. I was the one being taught. But it was just amazing.
Let me just add one thing. We sing congregational choir. Why don't we sometimes dance with liturgical dancers? It's an embarrassing thought.
But in Africa, they dance. They dance. Those of you who have been there, you've seen it. It's almost like they can't stand still. And so the choir starts with movement. You know, this might go on for 60 seconds before this starts happening, you know. And then somebody starts humming, and then finally they get into the whole performance. And I don't think that's because they're different from us. I think that's because they are more honest about what our physical bodies should be doing in worship. It seems to me that they have sort of a venue that they've cultivated that we haven't for some reason. But we can be glad we are at least a Lutheran singing church. Okay. This is the first of the two hymnals. This one was published in 1917. It's the one that I grew up with. How many of you know this hymnal? Yes. This was in the old Evangelical Lutheran Church, published by Augsburg, 1917, and then it was re-brought out in 1934. And we had this hymnal all the way through until this one. And this one came out in 1958 when the ALC was formed. This came along with the ALC, so the ELC and about 3 and then 4 other denominations all combined, and this one came out. And this one stayed until the green one that we just finished with. And the green one, this one and the black one are the ones that fed my soul for most of my life, because after St. Olaf, this came out when I was in junior, just about going into junior high, and then saw me all the way through St. Olaf. In fact, this particular hymnal was stolen from St. Olaf College. Yeah, probably. Anyway, after this, Kurt and I were in the Air Force world, and we did not worship in the Lutheran church until we finally came back to Holy Trinity and the green hymnal. So this one really, along with this, formed my worship. One more tiny thing about worship before I invite you to join me with some of these, which you may remember if you remember this hymnal. You know, I think that God in His wisdom created us with many facets. We are intellectual, we are physical, but we are also artistic. And many times we forget that we are artistic. Maybe our culture doesn't honor it as much as it honors the intellectual or the physical, but we are innately artistic. And we need to have the artistry in order to serve God wholly. I saw with my stepdad, who died a few years ago, of Alzheimer's, and who was extremely musical. I saw something happen in him through the years of his deterioration that really taught me a strong, strong lesson. This man was a singer, and he played harmonica. And when he went into the nursing home, he would go to the nurse's station and entertain them with hymns, or entertain them with his own 1940s dance music. He would sing and he would play his harmonica. And through the years that he was there, as he lost the ability to speak, and he lost the ability to do any kind of connecting, communicating, he could read, all of those things fell away. He could still sing. He couldn't speak, but he could sing. And that continued until just a few months before he died, which tells me that it comes from a completely different place in your brain. Okay.
See, I too was raised with traditionalism. I had been Lutheran, not Latin, in Missouri Seminary. So Lutheran, no, and then we went to
We step away from
LCA, the LC, all that good stuff, you know.
I've seen a blue hymnal, but it's not in my collection. I have an Norwegian hymnal, an Icelandic hymnal. Okay, this hymnal, there are 2 settings of the morning service in this hymnal. And The setting that my church used, it remained the same for year after year after year after year. We didn't change it, and it was a completely sung service. When I say a completely sung service, I mean a completely sung service. Completely sung. So I have, let's see, Kyrie Gloria and Sanctus. Okay.
How many of you were at the 11 o'clock last time and heard Pastor chant? Okay. That's another one we might experiment with sometime. Is have a fully sung.
You had two pastors.
With a one who shouldn't chant. I will certainly fall into that category, right?
Mark, the song says make it political, it doesn't say it has to be.
No, that's true.
You have to convince them that way. And then the Waste Project agreed with it.
Yes. Well, our pastor chanted, and Pastor Carl Hansen happened to have a fairly good voice, so it was not painful at all. And I have really wonderful memories of his flowing robes and whatever movements he was making around the altar, and the singing, always the wonderful singing. Okay, what you have in front of you, you'll look, there's a Kyrie. Let's just try the Kyrie. Ready? Okay, that you got to do better than that.
Well, wait, it's on the bottom of page 22.
It's on the bottom of page 22. You're right. Kyrie. Found it? Okay. And then, notice that it goes on when we worship here, usually the pastor speaks, or the liturgical deacon will speak the words, and then the choir and the congregation will chime in. Notice, the minister shall say, "Glory be to God on high," and then the congregation gets a chance to sing this whole thing. And you don't have to follow along if you don't want to. Some of you were reluctant to sing on the Psalms because you're not used to chanting. This is all chanting now.
First or second line.
Well, I remember doing everything.
Yeah,
I want us to sing the first line first, or there's 2 lines.
Right, and there's a repeat sign on the second line, so you go back and
You
you
sing them both and then next.
Yep. Okay, ready? And chanting doesn't go by the time signature. Chanting goes by the words. The way you would speak it is the way you sing it. So. It's right. Okay, and then when we have finished with all of that glory and glory, we go into now the pastor gets to shine. Hang on. The Apostles' Creed, we go through all of that stuff on the front and back of your sheet, and then we go into the collect for the day, and then we go into the gospel for the day, and we go into the Apostles' Creed, the sermon, and we get to the Eucharist, the prayers. And even, in this case, even the Lord's Prayer is not said, but sung. Everything's sung. When the institution of the words is done, the pastor sings them. Every our cranberry book is cranberry, but I was friends with somebody who was on the committee to name the color of the book. Oh my gosh. There were suggestions for teal, that was too close to green. There were suggestions for red, but that was too close to red. Couldn't be black, couldn't be brown. And finally, when it turned out to be red, you notice that it's not called red, it's called cranberry. So multiply that one little item by thousands of items. It takes a lot to produce a hymnal.
You only have a little bit of time.
Okay, in this one there are also two settings. There are actually, in the beginning of the book, it describes that there are 3 settings, and it gives a little history of each setting. And when it gets to the 3rd setting, it says, actually, it says, I will read you the words. The 3rd setting. It is much to be regretted that limitation of space has not permitted the printing in this book of the 3rd setting of service. Okay. What you just received is page 44. Okay, page 44. Okay, again, there is much more for the minister to sing or to chant than there is in our cranberry hymnal. The minister chants, "Please let us pray to the Lord," and we chime in with,
Peace that is from above, and for the salvation of our souls, let us pray to the Lord.
do you remember? Is this familiar? For the peace of the whole world, for the well-being of the churches of God, and for the unity of all, let us pray to the Lord. For this holy house, and for him, all that, for this holy house, and for them that in faith, piety, and fear of God offer here their worship and praise, let us pray to the Lord. Help, save, comfort, and defend us, gracious God. And Mark says we're done.
Thank you, guys. The point, of course, is that we've just scratched the surface of music, of the liturgy, of the history of Christian worship. And I was hoping that we're not going to just talk about our own experience of worship. But I hope that this is only beginning in the life of our community of trying out different things, experimenting with different things. I'll mention a couple of resources that you might find useful. If you go on the web and go to the elca.org, which is the website of our national church, and you go under the tab "Growing in Faith," that sounds familiar, and then you pick "Worship," you'll find that all sorts of resources there about worship, including a long commentary on our new cranberry book, a comment on the selection of the hymns. I mean, going from the red book to the green book in hymnody was extraordinarily controversial because the type of harmonies that were used and the type of time numbers they regularized things in various ways that deeply offended the musicians.
They also changed the modalities from minor to major in many places, which completely changed the collection of movies.
It also has discussion of some of the things that we haven't talked about. The paraments that change with the season. Here, did you notice say this is part of the paraments that the pastors are doing chastity? The banners. Now these banners don't have to be here. here. They're gorgeous, but they could be various other places in the church. The altar, obviously, or table has to be here. The Christ candle. There's a long piece in it about the Christ candle. If you have time to look at the thing about the Christ candle, is to see how many things become symbols as well. The Christ candle unlit, symbolizes the body of Christ. When it's lit, it symbolizes God's divinity. It normally plays an important part of the Easter celebration. It has the Alpha and the Omega on it. Some Christ candles will have 5 nails that you will put in at a particular time along with grains of incense to indicate the 5 wounds of Christ. The point is that everything in worship has over time gained, even if it didn't have it originally, symbolic. And the advantage of studying a little bit as a head part of it is that you're in a better place to appreciate the symbols. But even if you don't know it in your head, often the symbolism of doing certain things will get us at that deep level where we can use it. Influence. We don't have much time for questions at this point. I do hope you could reach me at Warren Becker Store Edwards at Harvard, or Edwards at Stoll. That's the same old. And I wish you the very best in worship this season. And I hope that this has given you some sense of the variety that the churches, the variety of image to the church, and also frees you up to consider variety and difference and change and experimentation in our worship today. Thank you, Tom.